Hey, I'm Craig Newmark. American democracy is under threat, and we all need to work together to protect the country and to protect our democracy. It's kind of like in World War II, when everyone was expected to play a role, and the first part of this is for all of us to learn a little more and to work together, strengthening American democracy, strengthening the country. The Civic Life Series is a big part of that, and the 92nd Street Y, New York, is the right forum for delivering all that. I appreciate your joining me. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to the 92nd Street Y New York series, The State of New York, where we give you a chance to get to know the people making decisions about New York's future. We want this series to serve as a platform for fostering meaningful dialogue and to introduce you to the decision makers who run New York, giving you the opportunity to learn more about what makes our city tick and the pressing issues that shape our lives. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of 92NY, and today we're turning our attention to public transportation. To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by the Chair and CEO of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, Janno Lieber. Stay tuned after our conversation for a discussion with distinguished journalists and New York City experts Nicole Gelinas, Errol Louis, and Brigid Bergin, who will lend their perspectives on the topics covered with the MTA Chair and CEO. Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us today. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. We're joined today by Chair and CEO of the MTA, Janno Lieber. Janno, welcome.
Good to be with you, Seth.
So let's start with an easy question. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about how you got to where you are? Where did your passion for transit come from? And what was the path that led you to this incredible and very important position?
Well, you know some of this stuff, Seth, but I grew up in New York in the 70s, in the city, and I was one of those kids who had two working parents, so no one was paying attention to me, and I took full advantage of having a bus and subway pass and really used the system to be an independent teenager and enjoy the city. And when I came out of college, one of the things that was really hot in New York was, let's turn around the subway system. Let's make this different than what it had become in the bad years of the 70s and maybe the early 80s, when the physical system had become really run down, and there was a lot of graffiti, and the sense that this was an unsafe place had taken over. So we had some great leadership at the MTA, and under Governor Carey, and then the early days of Governor Mario Cuomo, fixing the subway system was a hot issue. Honestly, I have always been drawn to the issues in New York which bring New Yorkers together. We have always had a fair amount of housing segregation based on economics and as we all know, other factors, but we all use transit, we use parks, we share the libraries. All the things that we share are what makes New York feel more cohesive and more together. And I've always been drawn to those things. I think transit is one of those things. So what happened is I got a job working for Ed Koch, who was then the mayor, in City Hall in the mid 80s, and doing staff work in support of the city's role in the MTA capital program and MTA issues in general. And then later on, I went to law school and did some other things, but ultimately I worked at US DOT in the Clinton administration. And then after a career in the sort of private, public real estate space where I worked with you on the World Trade Center rebuilding, I came to the MTA to run the construction outfit and ultimately when Governor Hochul came in office, moved up to the chair and CEO role.
So in your career, you've seen lots of ups and downs for New York, and certainly one of the big downs that we've all been through was the COVID pandemic. And my understanding is that even prior to the pandemic, there was a slow decline in ridership on the subways, but clearly when the city largely shut down, although the subways continued to run, ridership plummeted. My understanding is that now we're hovering around 70% or so of where we were prior to the pandemic, which is obviously a big improvement, but there's a big difference between 70% and 100%. I'm wondering if you can just share with our viewers where we are in the recovery, not just on the subways, but on the buses and our commuter rails as well.
Yeah, it's a good question in many different ways. Listen, during the height of COVID, we were down to 10% of pre-COVID ridership on the subways and something like 5% on commuter railroads. We were losing $200 million a week because of that loss of ridership. But importantly, the subways, unlike other places, mass transit kept running, and the workers who ran it were heroic because they enabled people to get to hospitals and pharmacies and grocery stores and the things that were necessary to help us power through the pandemic. So coming out of it, there was obviously, the advent of hybrid work obviously changed things, but there was a lot of discomfort for quite some time, which we're only fully starting to get over, of people being in crowded shared spaces where we're breathing on each other, needless to say. So it's taken us a while, but your numbers are right. The subways are at about 70%, but this is the paid ridership. So we're about 70% of pre-COVID on the subways, paid ridership. Buses are a little lower. Interestingly, the commuter rails are higher. Commuter rail is more like 75% of pre-COVID paid ridership. Here's the difference, and we can't forget the numbers. Fare evasion, people, whether it's jumping the turnstile or walking through the exit gate or other methodologies, fare evasion has gone way up as a lot of rules of public behavior broke down during COVID, and we haven't really gotten them back. So what the reason that's relevant is if you count the additional fare evasion, we're probably closer to 85% of pre-COVID ridership on subways and buses, and closer, upwards of 75, maybe closer to 80% on the commuter rail. So we're actually much further along than I would have thought, apples to apples with pre-COVID. But it definitely has had some consequences in terms of the MTA's economics, which we've done a fair amount to address, but which continue to be a challenge for New York City's economic future and operational future.
And I'd like to come back to the question of fare evasion and the MTA's economics, but just one other question about the recovery. When you and the leadership of the MTA look forward 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, is your projection that ridership is eventually going to return to what it was pre-COVID? Is it going to get to the same numbers but be distributed differently? What are you thinking about in terms of what the future looks like?
Listen, what we're planning for is to have a well-funded and high functioning MTA. So again, we're shooting for getting as many more riders as we can. And importantly, we have added a ton of service. We've done it both because we're seeing much more ridership response in the off hours, weekends, middle of the day, nights. People are going back when they have somewhere to go. They're using transit, and that's great. And we are providing more transit. We increased Long Island Railroad service by 40% when we opened the new Grand Central Madison terminal at Grand Central, but also because we had lots of extra track capacity. We're adding bus service. But our financial projections call for us to get another 10% in the next couple of years of paid ridership back through a combination of more people riding and hopefully reducing fare evasion. We're not crystal ball professionals about where this is heading. All we want to do is to provide really high level of service that will be attractive and support New York economically and all of our neighborhoods. So that's the strategy is really good service and a lot of service and making sure we can make the numbers work economically for New York.
So it sounds like service has improved, ridership is increasing, the financial picture, which we'll talk about in a minute, is better than it was at least a year or two ago. And yet, when we reached out to our community and asked them what questions they would want asked of you, one of the things that we heard repeatedly were questions about crime, questions about homelessness, questions about mental illness in the subway system. My understanding is that last year, overall crime actually decreased in the subways. I think it was down by something like 3%, although some categories were up, some categories were down. What's striking to me over the last couple of years is that when I go into a subway station, everyone now stands against the back wall of the platform, which I assume is because of fear of being pushed onto the tracks. And I don't remember that ever having been the case previously. So there's clearly a perception that something's not right in the subway system. What, in your opinion, is necessary for us, first of all, to change the reality with respect to the experience of being on the subway, including around crime, but maybe as importantly, what is necessary in order to change the perception?
So you've got it exactly right, Seth. That we have to make the subway and our mass transit system safe, but we also have to make it feel safe, because the reality is this is where people experience a lot of the things that make New York challenging, right? You're in an enclosed environment. We love our subway, but it does feel a little old and dingy in many respects. And you don't know the people that you're riding with or you're waiting on a platform with. And everybody's heard about some of these fairly infrequent but still terrifying cases where randomly people are attacked and, God forbid, pushed onto platforms. So we completely respect the way our riders feel, and they tell us that their principal issue that would cause them to ride more is the improved sense of safety from having more police officers in the subway system. And I know that there's a lot of range of opinion about, whether police are good or bad, or we want more or less, or we want more or less enforcement of what kinds of issues. But what the riders say is they love to see uniformed police officers. But here are the facts. You're right that subway crime went down last year by approximately 3%, especially important because ridership went up significantly. So it became less risky, for lack of a better term, to get on a subway car last year. Even more significant in some ways, there is less crime right now than before in the subway than there was before COVID. So we think the system overall is safe, but there's no question that the principal concern people are having is the presence of people who are struggling with mental illness issues and in many cases acting out in the public space. It's happening above grade, but when you're in a subway car on a subway station, it feels a little more uncomfortable and discomforting. In the last 2 days, I've had to get cops to try to coax somebody who was having a psychotic episode off a subway car. I really do get it. The governor and the mayor have really tried to turn this issue around. It may take a while, but the governor has started to push in lots of different ways to add psychiatric beds back to our hospital system. A lot of those were taken out of use for psychiatric inpatient treatment during COVID because all the beds had to be used for the COVID epidemic, but she's been pushing to put them back. We do a ton of outreach that the MTA works with the police department and the homeless and mental health authorities of the city of New York, and we are increasingly trying to fine-tune that system of outreach to get at people who are having severe mental illness and who are, whether they're sheltering in the subway system or they're outdoors. This is the real issue, is we have to get those people into treatment and, frankly, away from the public space where they're, really alarming to people are just going about their business. A couple of other things that we've done to try to increase the sense of safety in the system. One, we have a lot more cops on the platforms and throughout the system. That waxes and wanes with the city's economics because overtime for police officers is expensive, but the mayor has continued to invest in that. We're also made it a habit that when there are cops on the platform to let our riders know with conductor announcements so that if there is an issue of any kind, riders know when there's a cop on the platform that they can seek assistance or information from. And also we're making physical changes that while they may not solve the entire, every scenario of risk, would make it more comfortable to be on a subway platform by putting in barriers that you may have seen press coverage of, putting in these very practical, easy to install barriers so people know if I'm standing near one of those, God forbid, there's less chance that I could get pushed onto the tracks. But the main thing is we have to get the folks who, for whatever reason, are struggling with the mental health issues into treatment, into something that's better for them, but also better for our riders.
So speaking of barriers, there's the barriers in front of the tracks, and then there's also the barrier between the public and the platform. And another question that was raised when we spoke to people in our community was that with respect to the barriers that we have, the turnstiles, it is shocking how frequent it is that people just ignore them, jump over them, go through the exit gates, as you had alluded to. And I think I saw a number that last year it was estimated that the MTA lost almost $700 million as a result of fare evasion. What are you doing to address that? And should this be a priority? Because I've heard some people say that it's an equity issue and that maybe it's people who can't afford to ride the subway who are jumping the turnstile and we need to be more sympathetic to them. What is your response to that?
First of all, it is a real issue. It's an economic issue. Your number was right. Last year it was $700 million lost. That compares to pre-COVID, the number was somewhere in the mid $200 million range. So it's a huge upsurge in the level of fare evasion. And honestly, I noticed that this was happening 2 years ago now, and I made a speech about it. And frankly, a lot of people kind of rolled their eyes at me and acted like this wasn't a big issue. I think it's a big issue, not just for the MTA's bottom line, but also because once we lose the sense of fairness, that when regular riders who pay every day see people walking through the exit gates who are dressed like they are, and it happens at the stations right near the 92nd Street Y as much as it happens in other neighborhoods. Once people see that, the sense of fairness and equity breaks down, and there's a tipping point where people who don't break the rules in other parts of their life will say, screw it, I'm not paying either. I'm not going to be a sucker. We don't want that to happen. It tears at the social fabric when there's a sense that this is a lawless place where nobody plays by the rules. New York relies on everybody treating each other with a lot of respect because we share the public space. And that sense that we're all playing by the same rules when we're together is really important. Now, what are we doing about it? Well, as I said, I impaneled a group of not just law enforcement professionals, but social justice professionals so that we could figure out how to deal with this, but with a social justice lens. Number one, we are for the programs that give significant reduced fare benefits to people of low income. And we have pushed for that. And right now, if you're a low income person in the city of New York, you get half fare as if you were a senior or otherwise, a disabled a person as well. So significant sense of equity, and we're out there trying to push so that everybody knows that. In fact, we've even proposed that if you get a ticket, which is what happens when you fare evade, you don't get arrested automatically, you get in effect a parking ticket, that it will be the fine would be waived if you became a participant in that low income special fare program. So we're very focused on the sense of equity as well. The second thing we have to do is educate people. The biggest fare evasion population right now are kids. And the school system is not doing such a great job of giving them they have free Metro cards available, and yet whether it's the bureaucracy or other problems, they're not getting them. We want to get those kids onto the Omni system because they all have their phones in their hands, and the phone is the way for them to pay. And we're looking at different ways that we can incentivize kids to pay the fare, because we want them to get in the habit of paying the fare. So when they're grown up, it's part of regular behavior as well, rather than getting in the habit of fare evading. And third is, we got to change the physical infrastructure. Nobody's looked at the turnstiles in 40, 50 years. And the truth is, fare evasion is too easy, so we're making it harder to backhock. All the little ways that people fare evade. Putting fins on top of the turnstile bars to try to prevent people jumping over. These are incremental and experimental moves on our part to try to increase the barriers to fare evasion. But the worst thing is the damn exit gate, which is only supposed to be used for emergency exiting, but New Yorkers, God bless them, they pop the gate open to exit the system, and then people just file in. It becomes the super highway of fare evasion. So we are also piloting we got the approval from the fire code authorities that it's not a code or emergency egress problem, to put a delay on that gate so it doesn't open automatically under normal circumstances, that people will stop opening it to exit, and therefore there will be less opportunity for people to fare evade. Seth, the biggest problem I'm worried about is what I call opportunistic fare evasion. It's people who have their Metro card in their hand or their Omni open on their phone, but see the gate open and veer off and take a free ride because they don't think it matters, because they're just cutting corners, and they're encouraging others to do the same. If we could cut back on that behavior, I think we would start to push back against the problem. But this is a real issue. It's not going to go away. I'm thrilled when the cops give out tickets. People say, well, why is that? I'll say, not just because they're discouraging fare evasion, but they get people with weapons. It happened 3 times yesterday. Couple guns, a knife. When they do a fare evasion stop, they ask for ID, they check for warrants, and if somebody is obviously carrying, they take appropriate action. I am for fare evasion enforcement, but in the end of the day, we have a system which is mostly reliant on people playing by the rules.
So perhaps with all of these different experiments and pilots, you'll find a way towards...
Well, let me just make it clear. I wasn't clear about it. We are now in the middle of what will probably be a long process for designing and procuring an entirely new turnstile system, what we call the fare array, which will have higher barriers, it'll have more technology, and hopefully it won't have an easy to open exit gate that encourages fare evasion. But that's going to take years to install. It'll cost a fortune. But in the meantime, we're piloting all these other things, just to be clear, Seth.
No, and that's great. And hopefully at some point the MTA will start to reduce the number of fare evaders and therefore recoup greater revenue from the turnstile. But in the meantime, I'm sure that you weren't able to bank on that. And as of a year or two ago, it looked like the MTA was going to be facing a major fiscal cliff. And thanks to legislation that was passed last year by the state legislature that had been introduced by the governor, my understanding is that for the first time in over 20 years, the MTA can now look forward 5 years and project a balanced budget in each of those 5 years, which seems like a major accomplishment. Can you talk a little bit about what the fiscal situation was before that new legislation and what was in the legislation that has now shored up your finances for the next several years?
Sure. So at this time last year, going into the New York State legislative session, we were looking at a projected budget deficit, again, due to that reduction post-COVID in ridership and also the increase in fare evasion. The projected deficit was go at $2.6 billion. It was projected to rise in a couple of years to $3 billion. So the governor has been amazingly pro-transit. She's been the best friend to MTA riders that we could have imagined. The governor proposed a series of moves to give us to strengthen our revenue picture. And interestingly, those were done with the support of the New York City business community, which has been amazing. The business community said, we get it. We're letting people come into work 1 to 3 days a week, but we want great service every day of the week because we want to bring people back to their offices and we want to see the revival of the city. So the business community agreed to pay a little bit more in one tax, called the payroll mobility tax, to help us to balance the budget. And I just got to shout out to, because anytime you have business say, I'm willing to pay more in tax, it's kind of a man bites dog moment, but it really was transformational. And the governor and the business community made it happen. The legislature made it happen as well. Part of that deal, and we proposed it, was not just more revenue, but the MTA had to agree, and we, again, I said that was our idea, to cut $400 million out of that deficit through efficiencies without reducing service and without laying anybody off. And we are on the path to getting there. In fact, we've gotten far enough along that we've raised the number to $500 million, using technology to make how we renovate and maintain and rehab our buses and our subway cars, making it more efficient, rather than waiting for the check engine light to go off in effect, to know when certain components are going to fail more exactly, using technology, really aggressively using a variety of tools to reduce our absenteeism problem, which had grown, as many businesses have found, during COVID. So we are attacking our own budget deficit as part of that solution, and it's working. And it's something I'm very proud of. This is a very innovative MTA. I have to say, it's one of the things that I push. We experiment a lot. We try to find new ways to have technology work for us. One thing that doesn't get noticed, and I think is super important, and I'm proud of, is that we convinced the station agents, what I still call the token booth clerks, who used to be only inside the booths, to come out of the booths and to really be customer service agents. We're getting enormous benefits out of that from a standpoint of, an eyes and ears for law enforcement, better help for tourists and other people in how to navigate the system, how to use Omni and the MetroCard system. We've come up with a lot of other technology solutions that I won't go into to try to save money, to make bus travel much safer from a collision standpoint. There's a lot of innovation and experimentation going on that I'm trying to encourage, and that's been part of our success in saving that money that allowed us to get the budget balance.
And let me ask a question about the budget. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at the MTA's operating budget was that something like 25% of the expenditures were for a combination of pensions, retiree health benefits, and debt service for borrowing for previous projects. So all of those amounts, which I think were somewhere around almost $5 billion, were expenses that were essentially paying for things that happened in the past, which means that only 75 cents out of every dollar can be spent on current service. And what also struck me was that it looked like the collection from the fare box across the MTA is almost exactly equal to that total. So in one way of thinking about it, every dollar that somebody spends when they swipe an Omni or a MetroCard is going to these legacy expenses. Now, I understand that we have to pay for those and that they're owed to people, but it must, I would imagine, put a real crimp on your ability to innovate in the ways that you're describing. So I'm curious how you and the MTA are thinking about trying to control those expenses going forward so that we continue to have the money that we need to invest in the kinds of innovation that you've talked about.
Seth, you and I have known each other a long time, and I'd even go so far as to say we're friends. My advice to you is, as the head of 92Y, you shouldn't go hard against retirees. That's my strong advice to you as the CEO of a great institution. But all kidding aside, you're onto something. We have attacked each of those expenses. I mean, obviously those are legacy impacts. The MTA big picture spends about close to 75% on basic stuff for our employees. It's salary, healthcare benefits, and pensions. But we are attacking some of these other expenses that go on our operating budget. Debt service, which in fairness supports the capital program. It's the debt service for borrowing so that we can fix the subway and the buses and the commuter rails and make them better. So there's good expenses, but you want to manage that. And we've taken that down from about, it was at 18 or 19% of the operating budget to where it is 15. We restructured a lot of our debt during COVID so that we could protect the agency's ability to provide service in a difficult circumstance, and that has paid off. So we still borrow a lot in order to fix the system. Dick Ravitch said once, how are you going to get capital? You got to borrow money, but we just want to make sure it doesn't crush, as you said, the investment in current things, and also with specific responsible initiatives in our labor contracts. I think we are dealing with some of those expenses. It's incremental, but we made a deal in our last contract for example, how to deal with retiree health care, which put them on a plan which gets us more, which is better than the plans that they had, but it allows us to get more support from the federal government through the various Medicaid and other federal government health care programs. So we've reduced that cost. We're very much trying to attack that. But I'm not ashamed that we pay our workforce well, that we're still a place where a middle-class New Yorker can have a career and then have a reasonable pension, which is something that has gone out of fashion a lot of our economy. We're not ashamed of that, but we're trying to make that those burdens on our overall budget responsible as much as we can. I think we're making progress.
So let's conclude with a forward-looking question. I have a game that I play with my kids whenever we cross 60th Street in Manhattan. I point out the large piece of infrastructure that spans the street, and I ask my kids, do you know what that's for? And of course, it's, as I understand it, the infrastructure that will allow us to implement congestion pricing. As I've read, the purpose of congestion pricing really is twofold. One is it's designed to put a toll on vehicles coming into the central business district of Manhattan, which is highly congested, and it's designed to try to reduce congestions, to create an incentive for people not to drive and instead to take public transportation. And two, it's designed to create a stream of revenue that the MTA can then borrow against and use for capital improvements to subways, buses, et cetera. So can you explain for our viewers, first of all, how congestion pricing is going to work? And second of all, what the opportunity that congestion pricing is going to present for the MTA and for New Yorkers more broadly once that stream of revenue is created?
Yeah, I mean, listen, part of the challenge of this is getting everybody to recognize what should be obvious, which is we have a real problem with congestion in the central business district of New York City. I mean, it was confirmed again in the recent release of the Mayor's Management Report. The preliminary document showed that response time for ambulances have continued to go up, and it's the same for fire trucks and police cars. And our buses are going like 30% slower than they did 8 or 9 years ago. I mean, we are the cost of congestion, the negative impact of congestion is very significant. New York is the #1 most congested city in the United States. So, yeah, everybody, I know that this is a controversial topic, but that is issue one. We have to do something. London's already done this. Stockholm, Singapore, Paris is now doing something that's analogous, charging vehicles heavily to enter the CBD. So something has to be done. It is a health issue, not just air pollution, but again, you don't want your loved one to die in an ambulance waiting to get to the hospital. Or to get an ambulance waiting to get to a person in need. So that's the first motivation, and still, I think, what really drives this. The New York State Legislature enacted congestion pricing as the law of the state in 2019. It's frequently misunderstood, like I went on a drinking binge and came up with this idea because I wanted money for the MTA. Now, the legislature did it, and they did it to deal with congestion, but also to make sure that we were investing in mass transit so that the people who hopefully will come out of their cars and use mass transit, we have room, we've increased service, but we also need to invest in things like the expansion of the Second Avenue subway, which is being funded by congestion pricing. We have been going 100 miles an hour to make the system more ADA accessible, and we have 30 plus stations which are dependent on congestion pricing. We're trying to re-signal the A train and a lot of other trains so that we can run more cars, more subway trains more reliably, like we do on the L train and the 7 train, which are by far the best lines in the system. That's dependent on congestion pricing. We need an our bus system to be electric rather than diesel, and that's being funded by congestion pricing. So there are meaningful investments that will come out of this. Right now, it's controversy. There's change. There are a lot of suburbanites and some New Yorkers too, who have a problem with this. But when the discussion breaks out, everyone ought to bear in mind that 90% of New Yorkers take mass transit. Few walk, but take mass transit and don't drive to the CBD. There are only 100. We have 1.5 million jobs in the central business district of Manhattan. Only 140,000 people drive. So all of the complaint, which you'll hear on especially the radio, which caters to the folks stuck in their cars outside the Lincoln Tunnel, is about the drivers and so on. Let's also remember all the people whose kids have asthma because of the air pollution, the bikers and pedestrians who are getting hit by cars because road rage dramatically goes up in congestion, and also the folks who are just stuck in traffic, who are spending 120 hours a year stuck in traffic. That's terrible for our economy. Congestion pricing is also good for drivers because if you can move more quickly, along with my buses, it's a win even for the drivers who remain. That's part of the goal here.
Well, I wish you great luck with that and all your other many initiatives on behalf of the people of New York. Everything that you're working on impacts all of us, so I wish you great success, and I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
And I want to thank the 92Y customer. They're our customers. There are a lot of folks who live in Manhattan and use the system, and we love them and appreciate them, and appreciate the chance to talk to some of them.
Thanks, Janno. So we are gathered here to discuss the recent conversation that I had with Chairman and CEO of the MTA, Janno Lieber. I wanted to welcome the three of you back. For our first question, I wanted to start with the conversation that I opened with Janno about the recovery of the MTA since the pandemic. And according to Janno, in the depths of the pandemic, ridership was down to something like 10% of pre-pandemic levels, and now we're up to roughly 70% of pre-pandemic levels. And what Janno was saying was that we're actually exceeding that number during what used to be called the off hours, maybe trailing a little bit during the major commuting times of day. The first question I wanted to ask, and I'll start with you, Nicole, is when you look at what the implications of those ridership numbers are, do you think that we're kind of permanently doomed to be a city that will see 70 to 80% of ridership that we had pre-COVID? Or do you think that over time we're going to see ridership recover back to where it was pre-pandemic, and that our central business districts will become as vibrant and busy as they were pre-pandemic?
Right. I don't think that we're permanently doomed, but I think when and if ridership does get anywhere near 2019 levels, it will be very different. People will be back on the trains for very different purposes. And some of that is contingent on not cutting services to meet the lower ridership, which to the MTA's credit, it has never proposed doing so. And to the governor's credit, she she did step in and make sure that they did not have to do so financially. They sort of common sense, but not common sense answer would be ridership is lower, so service can be lower. That's not true. If you started to run trains half as frequently and make them less convenient, you would drive even more discretionary people away from the subway system. And in some ways, we have to increase service. As we saw on the Long Island Railroad with the opening of East Side Access, Grand Central Madison, if people are not, if office workers are not going to the office 5 days a week, and they're obviously not going to, we've settled into a 2.5, 3 day a week hybrid work week for people to go in. Even the banks and law firms who claim that they make people go in 5 days a week, you go over there on Friday, they're not there. It's much like fare enforcement. If you don't enforce it, people don't do it. But those people are not staying home. We're not in lockdown where people are staying in their houses. They're going out and doing things. It's just that in many cases, the transit system does not go on these trips that they're doing. If you're living in Long Island, Westchester suburbs, the transit system was built to take you to Manhattan and take you home at the end of the day. It's less so with the subway system, where there's much more flexibility around the city. But creating transit services where it is not primarily based around bringing people to the office and bringing them home at the end of the day, this is something, a long-term planning issue. But doing those two things, and yes, along with more housing in Midtown, other changes to the city to meet where people are, yes, we'll eventually get back. But eventually is a very long time. This could be something that is measured in decades, not years.
And Brigid, as a New Yorker and also somebody who speaks to many New Yorkers, do you feel as if there are things that either the city or the MTA could be doing that would encourage people to return to the transit system faster? Or do you think that this is just the natural outcome of changes in lifestyles? People, as Nicole said, are not commuting as many days a week. They're living their lives differently. What's your perception of that?
I think there are some serious issues in the transit system. And Janno Lieber, it's a good thing he has such a good sense of humor, because he has a really tough job. And he's got a lot of things to deal with that are not all within his control. Some of what we see in terms of the subway crime, he talked about it being down 3% last year, but felony assaults were at a 27-year high. And that, as you pointed out, that's as much a perception for the broader ridership, even though it's such a rare thing for individuals. There is this sense that, riding the subway can be dangerous. The morning that we are having this conversation, the second fatal shooting on a subway in 2 weeks has taken place. That is a problem. That's not necessarily a problem that's completely within the control of the MTA, but that is something that will impact ridership if it is not addressed in a more systematic fashion. We've also seen that the NYPD has tried to help. The mayor's office has been paying for, a huge amount of overtime to send additional police officers into stations. But we have, I think, some social norms that need to be restored in the wake of the pandemic that will contribute to whether or not people decide to use mass transit as the way to get around the city.
And when you talk about social norms, what do you mean more specifically?
Well, I thought it was so interesting when Janno Lieber talked about the issue with fare evasion, and that when we see the issues of fare evasion being, the biggest problem among kids as being part of the contributors to fare evasion, but connecting that to the idea of those kids not getting access to the Metro cards or the Omni passes through the city school system that they need. So I don't think any of these problems are necessarily going to be solved in isolation, but they need to be looked at across our city agencies and figure out how we can get people back to using the system in a way that, keeps it from going into, constant debt, and makes people feel like it's a reliable, safe way to get around.
And I want to come back to the issue of serious crime in a minute, and not that the topic that I'm going to talk about isn't serious as well. But both you and Nicole, Brigid, mentioned fare evasion. And Errol, I wanted to ask you a question about that. The numbers are really staggering. The $700 million figure that was cited by Janno as the cost of fare evasion last year alone, which is up significantly from what it was pre-COVID. What is it that has caused this to go from being a problem that the MTA could, I guess, absorb to one that is now in some ways threatening the financial viability of the whole transit system?
Well, the problems, of course, are all interconnected. And, it was always, even back in the 1990s, when broken windows policing and really trying to crack down on fare evasion was considered a public safety strategy, it was also a matter of fiscal management. It was really a matter of plugging some of the fiscal holes because there was rampant fare evasion back then. And so you could solve the one problem that got all of the attention, which was the public safety issues. And at the same time, they were dealing with a rather serious financial problem at the same time. So now we've, I think, sort of divorced those issues in the public's mind. And so obviously, in the news business, we're going to focus on the shooting and not on the slow leak of financing that the MTA experiences on a daily and weekly basis. So, until there's some attention that's paid to it, and until there's something like a reversal or at least an amendment of what at least 4 of the 5 district attorneys have decided, which is that, in keeping with the wishes of the voters who put them in, they're not going to be prosecuting fare evasion. For whatever reason, it's just not something that they're going to do. They don't want to spend prosecutorial resources on it. The voters don't want them to do it. It was dubbed as, crimes of poverty of one kind or another. Those misdemeanors, they just didn't want to deal with. And so you've got then sort of a perfect storm. You've got an open door, literally, people walk through the gate. You've got a slow fiscal drain, and then you've got some public safety problems that come with that attitude.
And do you perceive that there's any change in the political calculus of the district attorneys or other elected officials looking at the scale of this problem now and rethinking whether we should be classifying this more as a civil infraction as opposed to a criminal infraction?
No, I don't think we've had the right kind of adult conversation about this. It's one of the things that nobody likes to do, no politician likes to do, is go back to the voters and say, I'm doing what you told me to do, but there's some unintended consequences, and you or we're wrong, or this needs an adjustment, or we've got to think about this a little bit differently. We've got to reopen this conversation that we thought we had closed. It's just not something that political leaders like to do. It's much easier to try and sort of find a policy fix, ask for some more overtime, come up with some new acronym for a new program, put some signs up in the subway and urge people to pay their fare. But clearly that's not getting the job done.
Well, and another solution that Janno discussed was, you talked about the open door, was changing the design of the turnstile. And what I thought was interesting was when he was talking about that, he said that that's something that the MTA is pursuing, but that it's going to cost a fortune and take years to do. And Nicole, I guess a question for you is, why does it seem that everything that gets done in the subway system ends up costing a fortune and taking years?
Well, I think here it is the MTA serving as a shield for the elected officials who do not want to acknowledge, yes, you have to prosecute recidivist fare beating to get disorder and violent crime down on the subway. You are not going to fix this through an engineering fix. You cannot make the subway system into a prison where it is very, very difficult to enter and very, very difficult to exit. And this is true around the world in places that have less fare evasion. It's sort of, just like with the glass doors protecting the subway platform, it's become a myth in New York City that the London and Paris systems have glass doors, and that's why people aren't pushed onto the subway. They do not. They have maybe 1 or 2 subway lines with these glass doors, the newer lines. Most of the lines have open platforms just like we have. Same thing with the fare gates. It's not that difficult to jump over the fare gate in London. People just don't do it, although actually it's becoming a bigger problem there as well over the past year. But previously, although it's very low fare gate and you could jump over to exit, it's just not a common behavior. We have lost sight of a lot of the lessons that we learned during the 1990s, that if you stop someone at the fare gate, you get a gun off the system, you get a knife off the system, you get a person with an outstanding warrant for violent crime off of the system. And the police are still actually doing that. But the problem is, if you pile up multiple civil summonses for transit fare evasion, there is not a point anymore where you do get arrested. And so these summonses are just not being paid, where back to the 1980s, where the police used to call them disappearance tickets instead of desk appearance tickets. So a big part of the solution is going to have to be in the criminal justice system, and yes, in the mental health system as well. But it's not going to be an engineering fix. And so to keep saying that we're going to be waiting for it to be fixed for a long time.
And Brigid, coming back to this question of not just fare evasion, but more serious crime in the subway, the recent news of increases in violence on the subway, including a couple of recent shootings, are certainly extremely disturbing. But if you look statistically, at least, the subways remain relatively safe, and they're certainly safer than they were a number of years ago. And yet when you go down to the subway and you wait on the platform, you see everyone standing against the back wall. Clearly, people have the perception that the subway is much less safe than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. What do you think the reason is for this change in perception? And do you think that perception actually reflects something real that the statistics aren't capturing?
I mean, I do think, as you said, these high-profile incidents of crime in the system do affect how people feel when they go into subways. And then you couple that with the fact that we know we have a mental health crisis, certainly in this country, but here in New York City. And when you are in a subway car with someone who is having a crisis, I mean, Janno Lieber talked about having to get help for 2 people having a psychotic episode in 2 days. I mean, that is a striking example of the type of things that people experience and that we are still trying to figure out how to deal with. I want to pick up on part of your question to Nicole, though, about why it takes so long to address some of these issues in the subway system, by just pointing to another recent example of something that, as an outer borough resident, made me scratch my head. Recently, the governor made a decision to use $20 million from something called the Outer Borough Transit Fund to give rebates to drivers across, who have to cross bridges in the Bronx and in Queens. And that's money that arguably perhaps could go towards some of these improvements within some of these stations in the outer boroughs, but instead it's going to go to drivers at a time when, it seems the policy is to try and discourage as much use of individual cars. But, that sort of incongruity between what the larger goals are and how we're deciding to spend our money, I think, explains why it takes so long to accomplish some of these larger goals. And certainly makes me scratch my head.
And I want to turn in a minute to the topic of finances. But Errol, maybe just to put a ribbon around this conversation, you used the phrase a couple of times, Brigid, head scratcher. A head scratcher for me, and a question that I often ask myself is, I travel to cities all over the world. I travel to cities all over the country. I take public transportation. And the things that one regularly sees on the subways here in New York, whether it's the people having psychotic episodes or people rampantly jumping the turnstiles, you just don't see that when you go to other cities. And I'm wondering, Errol, do you have a theory as to why it seems that the system is so different and the experience of riding the system is so different here from almost anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think we basically don't care. I mean, we don't value it. Honestly, I'm I ride. I live in Crown Heights, right near the border of Bed-Stuy. So on any given day, I'm getting on the system or getting out of the system in Crown Heights or Bedford-Stuyvesant. And these stations are neglected. They are falling apart. They are not kept up to grade. They are not cleaned regularly. And that flows through to how the people are treated. The people are not respected. The people are not cared for, whether it's the riding experience of the people who pay the fare or the people in distress who are turning to the system or lounging around in the system or sort of bouncing around in the system to try and find shelter or to get from here to there. So, when every time there's a hope count or a tragic situation and they try to summarize what we know about who's in the system and why, it comes down to, I think, an embarrassingly small number. This is my head scratcher. If there's 4,000 unhoused people, many of whom have serious mental illness, who are on the streets or in the subways, in a city of 8+ million with 35,000 cops, and I don't know how many social workers on the city's payroll, you could assign a team to every single one of them, it seems to me, and it would be at least as bad as what we're doing right now, and probably a lot better. What I see us as doing is, it's very convenient because the problem always moves. They say, if you see something, say something. And they make a point of saying, you can call the police or you can hop out at any given station. You can call for help if you see someone in distress and so forth. But I think of it more like, and you don't see this in other cities, we keep the trains moving 24 hours a day. And that's almost like a metaphor as well as a vector and a method of just moving a lot of different social problems onto the next station. Just keep it moving, put them on the E-train, let somebody at the other end of the line figure it out. And of course, it turns out there is no other person at the end of the line. So I mean, that's what I would suggest is what's going on here. Because when you go to Paris, you go to London, there comes a time, it's usually a little too early if you want to go out and party, but they shut the whole system down. In New York, we never stop. We just keep circulating issues, people, problems, and policies without really sort of stopping long enough to kind of get our hands around it.
Can I say one more thing on the crime issue? Seth, you mentioned the perception. It's not a perception issue. We've had, just this morning, as Brigid said, we had our third subway homicide of 2024. Since March of 2020, when the March of 2020, we had 3 subway homicides all in a row and nobody noticed because it was a COVID madness. We've had 34 homicides in the subway in little less than 4 years. From 1997 to 2019, we had an average of 1 or 2 homicides in the subway. So we are now going on and having had 15 years worth of subway homicides in less than 4 years. The vast majority of them random strangers who don't know strangers. The first homicide of the year, for example, was man playing his radio too loud. There was a dispute over that. One of them ended up shot. This is disorder escalating into violence. Second subway homicide, juvenile gangs having a shootout in the Bronx. An innocent commuter was killed. And this is an issue of the juvenile justice system that has fallen apart over the past 4 years. So people are quite correct to feel that they're in more danger in the subway. No, you're not likely to be murdered on the subway, but you are far more likely to be murdered on the subway than you were 4 years ago. And when transit advocates and progressive elected officials say, you're just either crazy or stupid or a liar, this does not help get people back onto the subway system. People know that they are not crazy. They know that they are in greater danger. And so the elected officials just acknowledging that and acknowledging that it is not a perception problem is a big part of fixing the problem.
And well, I'll stick with this topic then for one more question to you, Brigid, which is, I'll come back to a question I asked a couple of minutes ago to Errol, which is that if people generally feel as if they're not safe on the transit, on our transit system, or less safe than they once were, And if, as Nicole was saying, that perception is not just a perception, but it's reflective of at least some version of reality, why is it that there's not more of an outcry among either the electorate or our elected officials to actually try to do something about it? Why is it that it seems as if we're continuing to double down on policies that, at least so far, have not really arrested the problem?
I mean, I think that I wouldn't shut the door on hearing this become an issue for voters. We had some really strange election cycles recently, dominated by the pandemic, where issues of public health were among the leading concerns, and then issues of public safety, writ large, were among the driving concerns. I think that it's reasonable to think that in an upcoming, 2025 mayoral election could, subway crime emerge as an issue. I think that that's quite likely, quite possible. But I think, it is something that we do want to bring some new attention to. I think what's also interesting is there are these equity questions that need to be wrestled with. We've spent some time talking about crime. We spent some time talking about fare evasion. And when you get into the numbers of that and looking at where the enforcement is actually happening, it's about a quarter of the subway stations that make up the vast majority of enforcement for fare evasion, even taking into account ridership. There are some issues going on there with making sure that we're not ignoring fare evasion in one spot in order to address it in another. There needs to be a systematic approach to how we address some of these issues, to send a message to both riders and to people who work in the system that these are issues that we take seriously.
So the issue of crime is clearly a complicated one. Another complicated issue is the issue of the MTA's finances. And in a piece of good news, the MTA was able to announce, as of the end of last year's legislative session, that it could forecast a balanced budget for at least 5 consecutive years, which was something that it had not been able to do previously for at least 20 years before. Errol, as you look at the agreement that was reached in Albany that made that possible, what do you make of it? Is this something that we should be looking at and feeling secure about, or is it something where there's another layer to the story?
Well, look, there's going to be more fights over it for sure, and it's always in danger. These agreements are always in danger of falling apart, and I think all of us have seen sessions where there were cash grabs in order to cure deficit situations where you can just raid the MTA. All right, the legislature has the power to do that. So does the governor. So hopefully we will hold firm on this. Hopefully the congestion pricing arrangements will work reasonably as forecast and as planned and as promised. But I would say it's always in danger of unraveling. And honestly, they reached this point, frankly, due to, in part, I think, some good luck. I think the transit advocates certainly helped, but I don't hear transit being discussed in the way that it probably should be, as an essential component of both the economy, the quality of life, and frankly, the price of housing. Much of what we see as a housing shortage is also a transportation problem, where if you can get a reasonable commute, whether it's 3 days a week or 5, to some of the exurbs, to every neighborhood in the city, then you really have at least a pathway, or in theory, a pathway out of some of the extreme housing shortage. But I don't hear it talked about that way. That's why I would tend to think that you've got to keep an eye on Albany. You've got to keep an eye on the overall budget, because when push comes to shove, there's always the possibility of a raid on the MTA.
And I know, Nicole, you spend a lot of time analyzing the city's budget, the state's budget, the MTA's budget. When you look at the deal that was struck, whether it's the imposition or the increase in the payroll mobility tax, or the efficiency savings that Janno was talking about that the MTA itself put on the table. How do you look at those pieces of the deal?
Well, I agree with Errol. We're in a much better situation than a lot of transit stations around the country are right now. WMATA in Washington looking to put together a package from the 4 different jurisdictions that help provide it with money, and a much harder argument there and much less interest in transit there. Same thing in San Francisco and California, where, despite the fact that California is supposed to care so much about the environment and be so progressive, a lot of resistance from the state government to rescuing BART, where ridership just evaporated with the tech industry kind of abandoning San Francisco for a little while. So we're in a much better fiscal position, and that, yes, the governor and the legislature did increase the payroll tax, but that also comes with a cost. I mean, this is not the best time to be increasing a tax on jobs in the New York City region when our recovery is so much slower than the national recovery. We're only about 1% of our jobs higher than we were in 2019, whereas the country as a whole is about 5% more jobs than it had in 2019. So the increase in the payroll tax really has to go along with longer term cost reforms and getting at least some modest productivity concessions from the unions in each round of labor agreements would be a good idea. And that's really not something that the MTA has the political support to start doing.
So let's end the conversation with just a couple of quick questions about congestion pricing. The congestion pricing plan that the MTA is intending to put in place was something that was passed by both houses of the legislature. It was signed into law by then Governor Cuomo. Presumably there was some broad political support behind the plan, at least at some point in time. And now, as we're getting closer and closer to the rollout of that plan, we're starting to see more and more opposition, whether it's from elected officials in New Jersey or recently elected officials in some of the outer boroughs, including Staten Island, members of leadership of the municipal unions. Brigid, what is it that happened between when this was passed and now that has suddenly made congestion pricing seemingly so much more controversial than it felt like it was when it was initially passed?
I think it's closer to becoming real, and people are feeling the threat of having to actually pay not an insubstantial amount of money to come into the city on a regular basis, coupled with everything we've already been talking about, that concerns around and comfort when riding the mass transit system is its own set of issues. And that some people have then, as a result, become more accustomed to driving into the central business district, and they feel this anxiety about how that's going to upend this change that they have made. So I think we're going to continue to see some of that, and I think it'll be interesting. Hopefully, it will still move forward, because if you are in the central business district ever, it is just a parking lot. And we know that there are all kinds of fallout from that makes, certainly public health issues, getting around, the ambulance times issue, which is something that Janno's talked about. But I mean, that's a real issue. If you can't get emergency vehicles and emergency responders around the city, that's a problem for all of us. And so I think, we need to weigh some of this collective anxiety, but hopefully push forward and get this in place, and then understand that this policy is new. It's a change in policy. It's a change in culture, and it's going to require some adjustment and refinement. And there's going to be fallout that we haven't anticipated yet, and we're going to have to address that when we start to deal with it.
And I'll give you the last word, Errol. In your reporting, as you speak to people in city government and state government at the MTA, is the general consensus that congestion pricing will in fact go into effect, or are people concerned that these lawsuits will actually potentially sink the policy altogether?
My sense is that this is going to be a hard, long slog, and that people are going to file every creative kind of legal challenge that they can imagine. And it's going to go on for quite a while. As long as it doesn't stop it from happening, though, the theory is that just as there was opposition in London until they got the program up and running, that once it's up and running, people will say, oh, I can actually get from here to there. I can save 10 to 15 minutes going from downtown to midtown, or I can actually get crosstown in midtown without having to allocate 45 minutes. If that were to happen, and in theory it could, some of the opposition might go away. And that's a big maybe.
Well, once again, we're looking at a series of issues facing our region that we could probably spend another 5 or 10 hours discussing. But I wanted to thank all of you for your insights again, and to say that I'm looking forward to the next topic and our next conversation. So Nicole, Brigid, Errol, thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. From the 92nd Street Y, New York, I'm Seth Pinsky.